I came to fix her sink, just a kid with a toolbox and no clue. But when Nora whispered, "Am I too strict?" her eyes held something forbidden. What happened next would burn in me forever. The rain came down like it was trying to drown the world, each drop smacking the pavement of Marwood Lane with a vengeance that matched my mood. I was 22, soaked through my jacket, my boots heavy with water, as I trudged toward the narrow brownstone at the street's end. The call had come out of nowhere, an emergency job for a leaking pipe at 3B, a name I didn't recognize, Nora Hadley. I'd only been with Tilden Plumbing for a month, still green enough that every job felt like a test I might fail. Greg, my boss, had tossed me the van keys with a half smirk, his voice gruff. "Don't mess this up, Finn." So here I was, Finn Carver, toolbox in hand, nerves jangling like loose change, hoping I could pull this off without looking like an idiot. The brownstone loomed ahead, its faded brick barely holding its own against the storm. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges groaning like they hadn't moved in decades. The hallway was dim, smelling of damp wood and something faintly floral, like someone had tried to mask the building's age with a cheap air freshener. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my boots leaving wet prints on the worn carpet. Apartment 3B was at the end of the hall, its door painted a chipped navy blue. Sharp and deliberate, and waited, my heart thudding louder than it should have. I ran through my script in my head: be polite, be professional, don't say anything stupid. My hands were slick with more than just rain. The door opened and I froze, toolbox dangling awkwardly from my grip. Nora Hadley stood there, and she wasn't what I expected. She was older, late 30s, maybe pushing 40. But there was a sharpness to her, a kind of quiet intensity that hit me like a static shock. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, loose strands framing her face like they'd given up on staying tidy. Her hazel eyes flicked over me, quick and assessing, and her lips pressed into a thin line, not quite a smile, but not unfriendly either. She wore a gray sweater that slipped off one shoulder, exposing a sliver of pale skin, and jeans that hugged her in a way that felt unfairly distracting. She was beautiful, but not in the glossy, curated way I was used to seeing at bars or on my phone. It was heavier, raw, like she carried a weight I couldn't see but could feel. "You're the plumber?" Her voice was low, with a slight edge, like she wasn't sure I was the right guy for the job. "Finn Carver, Tilden Plumbing," I said, wincing inwardly at how stiff it sounded. "You've got a leak?" She nodded, stepping aside to let me in. "In the kitchen. It's been dripping for days, but tonight it's a full-blown mess." "Come on." I followed her inside, the apartment wrapping around me like a warm blanket despite the chill I'd brought in. The place was small, cluttered but not chaotic, every corner filled with signs of a life lived deeply. Books were piled on every surface, paperbacks with cracked spines, hardcovers with notes scribbled in the margins. A half-empty coffee mug sat on a side table next to a leather couch that sagged in the middle like it had held too many late nights. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon, and a single lamp cast a golden glow across the hardwood floor, softening the edges of the room. I tried not to stare as we moved through a narrow hallway to the kitchen, where the steady drip, drip, drip of water echoed like a metronome. "It started getting worse around dinner," Nora said, crossing her arms and leaning against the counter. Her posture was casual, but her eyes were sharp, watching me like she was measuring something. "I tried tightening it myself, but I think I just made it angrier." I set my toolbox down and crouched under the sink, the space tight and unforgiving. The pipe was old, the joint corroded, the washer a crumbling relic. Water glistened on the cabinet floor, pooling in a bucket that was already half full. "Yeah, this is rough," I said, glancing up at her. Her face was closer than I expected, her expression unreadable but intense. "I'll need to replace the coupling and the washer." Should be quick. She nodded, her arms still crossed, her fingers tapping lightly against her elbow. Good. I'd rather not swim to bed tonight. I chuckled, the sound more nervous than I meant it to be, and got to work. The space was cramped, my shoulders brushing against the cabinet walls, my hands fumbling more than they should have. Nora didn't leave. She stayed right there, leaning against the counter, her presence filling the room like a low hum. I could feel her eyes on me, not judging, but studying. It made my skin prickle, my focus slipping as I tried to tighten the new coupling. I needed to say something, anything to cut through the silence. So, you live here alone? I asked, then immediately wanted to kick myself. Too personal, too forward. I kept my eyes on the pipe, pretending I hadn't just stuck my foot in my mouth. She didn't answer right away, and I thought I'd screwed up. But then she said, yeah, just me and the books, and apparently this sink that hates me. Her voice was lighter now, but there was a weight behind it, something she wasn't saying I didn't push. No pets? No roommates? I asked, trying to keep it casual as I swapped out the washer. No pets, no roommates. She paused, and I could hear the hesitation like she was deciding how much to give away. It's been just me for a while now. There was a story there buried in the quiet of her words, but I didn't know how to ask for it. Focused on the pipe, tightening the new coupling until the drip stopped. The bucket was still, the kitchen silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I slid out from under the sink, wiping my hands on a rag, and stood, meeting her gaze. She was closer now, her arms still crossed but her posture softer, like she'd let down a guard I hadn't even noticed. Looks like you're good, I said, gesturing to the sink. No more indoor waterfall. She tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You're quick. Thanks, Finn. I shrugged, feeling the heat creep up my neck. Just doing my job. She didn't move, and neither did I. The kitchen felt smaller, the air thicker, like we were standing on the edge of something neither of us could name. I noticed the way her fingers curled into her sweater, the way her eyes lingered on me a second too long. My mouth went dry, and I scrambled for something to say, anything to break the tension. You're kind of strict about your kitchen, huh? I said, nodding at the neatly stacked dishes on the counter, the way the spices were lined up like soldiers. It was a weak attempt at a joke, but I was grasping. She raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching. Strict? Am I? I grinned, feeling a little bolder. Yeah, you've got that everything in its place vibe, like you're running a tight ship. Her laugh was soft, almost reluctant, but it hit me like a spark. Maybe I just like things done right, she said, her voice low, her eyes locking on mine. That look, it wasn't flirtation, not exactly, but it was something that made my pulse race, my thoughts scatter. I was supposed to leave, to pack up and go, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. She stepped toward the coffee maker, her movements slow and deliberate. You want a coffee? You're soaked, and it's miserable out there. Least I can do. I should have said no. I had no business staying, no reason to linger. But the rain was still pounding outside, and the idea of sitting with her, even for a few minutes, was too tempting. Yeah, I said, against every rational thought, coffee sounds good. She moved with a quiet grace, measuring out the grounds with a precision that felt almost ritualistic. I leaned against the counter, watching her, noticing the way her fingers brushed the edge of the coffee pot, the way her hair caught the light. We talked. About nothing, really. The weather, the brownstone's creaky pipes, the way Marwood Lane always seemed to flood. But every word felt heavier than it should have, every pause loaded with something unspoken. She handed me a mug, her fingers grazing mine for a split second, and I felt it, a jolt, like touching a live wire. We sat at her tiny kitchen table, the rain a steady drum against the window. The coffee was strong, bitter, grounding me in a way I desperately needed. She asked about my job, About how I ended up wrenching pipes instead of chasing some bigger dream? I told her the truth. College didn't stick, I needed something steady, and plumbing was as good as anything else. She listened, her eyes locked on mine, and I felt seen in a way I wasn't used to. Too seen. "What about you?" I asked, turning it back on her. "What do you do?" She sipped her coffee, her gaze drifting to the window. "I teach literature at the community college on Baxter Street. Old books mostly, the kind that make students roll their eyes." I laughed, leaning back in my chair. "I read some of those in high school. Didn't get most of it, but I didn't hate it." She smiled, a real one this time, and it softened the edges of her face. "Most people don't get it at first. Takes time." The conversation flowed, but the silences were heavier, charged with something neither of us acknowledged. I noticed too much, the way her fingers traced the rim of her mug, the way her eyes flicked to me and then away, like she was afraid of being caught. She was older, carrying a life I couldn't begin to understand, and yet there was a pull, a thread tying us together in that cramped kitchen. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it, and I knew she did too. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and I knew I had to go. My job was done, the sink was fixed, and I had no excuse to stay. But leaving felt wrong, like walking away from something unfinished. I stood grabbing my toolbox. "Thanks for the coffee," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I should head out." She stood too, her movements slow, like she was reluctant to let the moment end. "Thanks for saving my kitchen," she said, following me to the door. At the threshold, I turned back, and she was closer than I expected, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my chest ache. For a second, I thought she might say something real, but she didn't. "Night, Finn," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Night, Nora," I replied, stepping into the hallway. The door closed behind me, and I stood there, the rain's faint patter filling the silence. "You don't know it yet, but this is just the start. What she does next will catch him off guard." The days after that first night at Nora's apartment dragged on, each one heavy with the memory of her voice, her eyes, that fleeting moment when her fingers brushed mine. I was 22, still stumbling through the edges of adulthood, and yet she was there etched into my thoughts like a line from a book I couldn't put down. I'd wake up in my cramped studio on the outskirts of Crestview Heights, the ceiling cracked and the radiator hissing, and I'd see her, Nora Hadley, with her loose bun and her quiet, piercing gaze. I told myself it was nothing, just a job, just a conversation, but my mind kept circling back to the way she'd looked at me, like I was more than just the guy with the toolbox. It was unsettling, the way she'd gotten under my skin without trying. Friday morning, I was back at Tilden Plumbing, the shop a familiar mess of grease and coffee stains. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air smelled of motor oil and burnt toast from someone's breakfast. Greg was at his desk, scribbling on a clipboard, his mustache twitching as he muttered about schedules. I was sorting through my tools when he looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Carver, you're heading back to Marwood Lane, 3B, Hadley. Sink's acting up again." My stomach twisted, a mix of nerves and something I didn't want to name. "Again?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I fixed it, checked it twice." Greg shrugged, already turning back to his clipboard. "She called this morning, says it's draining slow. Go figure it out." I didn't argue. I grabbed the van keys and headed out, the drive to Marwood Lane feeling shorter than it should have. The sky was gray, the air heavy with the promise of more rain, and every stoplight seemed to mock me, giving me too much time to think. Had I missed something with the sink? I'd been thorough, hadn't I? Or was this about something else? The thought lodged itself in my chest, sharp and persistent, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter to keep my hands steady. When I reached the brownstone, the street was quiet, the pavement still damp from last night's storm. climbed the stairs to 3B, my boots echoing in the empty hallway, the faint lavender scent lingering in the air. I knocked, and the door opened almost immediately. Nora stood there, and I felt that same jolt from the first night, like stepping on a live wire. She was dressed differently today, a white blouse, slightly sheer, tucked into dark slacks that made her look like she belonged in a lecture hall, not this cluttered apartment. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, catching the morning light that spilled through the hallway window. She was definitely older than me, late 30s or maybe 40, but there was a quiet strength in her that made the number irrelevant. Her hazel eyes were tired, shadowed, like she hadn't slept, and I wondered what kept her up. "Finn," she said, her voice softer than I remembered, almost hesitant. "Thanks for coming back." "No problem," I said, shifting the toolbox in my hand. "You said the sink's acting up?" She nodded, stepping aside to let me in. "It's slow. Draining weird. I don't know how to explain it." The apartment was the same, but felt different in the daylight. The clutter more vivid. Books stacked haphazardly on shelves. A scarf draped over a chair. A half-finished crossword on the coffee table. The cinnamon scent was fainter now, mixed with something earthier, like old paper. I followed her to the kitchen, where the sink sat innocent, no bucket, no drip. I set my toolbox down and crouched, peering at the drain. "Slow, huh? Might be a clog further down? Let's see." She leaned against the counter, same spot as before, her arms crossed loosely, her fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against her elbow. I unscrewed the P-trap, expecting a mess of hair or grease, but it was clean, almost too clean. I frowned, checking the pipes further down, running my fingers along the joints. Nothing, no blockage, no residue, no reason for a slow drain. I glanced up at her, and she was watching me, her expression unreadable but heavy, like she was holding something back. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost cautious. "Yeah, just..." I stood, wiping my hands on my jeans. "I'm not seeing anything. It looks fine." "You sure it's draining slow?" She bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the counter. "Maybe I overreacted. It seemed off this morning, but maybe it's okay now." I turned on the faucet, letting the water run, watching it swirl down the drain without hesitation. It was perfect, too perfect, and a part of me wondered if there'd ever been a problem. I shut off the water and turned to face her. "Seems good to me. Want me to check anything else while I'm here?" She didn't answer right away. She was staring at the sink, her lips parted slightly, her fingers tightening around her arms. The kitchen was quiet, the refrigerator's hum the only sound, and I felt it, that same thickness in the air, that pull that made my chest tight. I should have packed up and left, but I didn't. I couldn't. "Nora," I said, my voice softer than I meant it to be. "Is something wrong?" She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment I saw something raw, unguarded. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I shouldn't have called you again. I don't know." I stepped closer, not sure what I was doing, only that I couldn't walk away. "It's okay. I'm here, but this isn't about the sink, is it?" She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "No, it's not." The air between us was heavy, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I wanted to ask more, to push, but I didn't know how. Instead, I just stood there, my hands stuffed in my pockets, trying to act like my heart wasn't pounding. "Talk to me," I said finally. "What's going on?" She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that didn't match the softness in her eyes. "I don't even know where to start. I'm tired, Finn. Tired of being alone, tired of pretending I'm not. I teach these kids about passion and heartbreak in books, but I haven't felt anything real in years. And then you show up and You're so young, so alive, and I don't know what to do with that." Her words hit me like a wave, raw and unfiltered, and I didn't know how to respond. I just stood there watching her unravel, feeling like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to. "You're not alone," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I mean, you're not. You're more than you think you are, Nora." She looked at me, her eyes wide, searching, and I felt the weight of it, the impossibility of this moment, the line we were towing. "You don't get it," she said, her voice trembling. "You're too young. I'm too old for this, for you." "Don't say that," I said, stepping closer, close enough to catch the faint floral scent of her perfume. "You called me because you wanted to, and I came because I wanted to." Her breath hitched, and she looked up at me, her eyes locking on mine. The kitchen felt smaller, the world narrowing to the space between us. I noticed everything, the way her hair fell across her cheek, the way her fingers curled into her sleeves, the way her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. I wanted to reach for her, to close the distance, but I didn't. Not yet. "You want coffee?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. "Since you're here." I should have said no. I had other jobs, a schedule, Greg waiting for me to check in. But I didn't. "Yeah," I said, my voice rough. "Coffee's good?" She moved to the coffee maker, her hands steady but slow, like she was buying time. We talked about her students, about my failed attempt at college, about the way Marwood Lane always seemed to flood. But every word felt loaded, every pause a step closer to something we couldn't name. She handed me a mug, her fingers grazing mine again, and I felt that same jolt, stronger this time, like it was pulling me under. We sat at the table, the conversation flowing, but the silences heavier, each one thick with what we weren't saying. I noticed too much, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way her eyes flicked to me and then away, like she was afraid of being caught. She was older, carrying a life I could only guess at, but there was a pull between us, a thread I couldn't cut. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I didn't want to leave. When the coffee was gone, I stood, grabbing my toolbox. "I should go," I said, though every part of me wanted to stay. "Greg's probably wondering where I am." She nodded, following me to the door, her steps slow, like she was fighting the same urge I was. "Thanks for coming back, Finn," she said, her voice soft, almost regretful. "Even if it was probably nothing." "No problem," I said, pausing in the doorway. Her eyes met mine, and there it was, that pull, that thing I couldn't shake. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat felt tight. "See you around," I said, stepping into the hallway. "See you," she replied, her voice barely audible. I walked down the stairs, the air outside cool and sharp, the streetlights casting long shadows across Marwood Lane. I climbed into the van but didn't start it. I just sat there, my hands gripping the wheel, replaying her words, her touch, the way she'd looked at me. Something was shifting, and I wasn't sure I could stop it. What she says next will break everything open, and he'll never be the same. The week after my second visit to Nora's apartment felt like wading through fog, every moment blurred by the memory of her voice, her eyes, the way her fingers had grazed mine over a cup of coffee. I was 22, barely holding my own in a world that felt too big, too fast, and yet she was there, Nora Hadley, a name that had carved itself into my thoughts like a brand. I'd lie awake in my tiny studio on Crestview Heights, the radiator clanking, the streetlights bleeding through the blinds, and I'd see her, her loose waves of dark hair, her hazel eyes that seemed to see right through me, her quiet strength that made me feel both grounded and unmoored. I told myself it was nothing, just a job, just a moment, but every time I closed my eyes, I was back in her kitchen, the air thick with something I couldn't name. Friday evening hit like a freight train. I was sprawled on my sagging couch, a lukewarm beer in hand, the TV droning through a basketball game I wasn't watching. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a text from Greg. Marwood Lane, 3B, Hadley, urgent, sinks leaking, go now. My heart lurched, the beer nearly slipping from my grip. Urgent? I'd fixed that sink, checked it twice, left it perfect. Was it really leaking again, or was this something else? The thought lodged itself in my chest, sharp and heavy as I grabbed my toolbox and bolted out the door, the van's engine growling as I tore through the quiet streets. Dusk had settled over Marwood Lane, the brownstone's brick facade glowing faintly under the flickering streetlights. The air was cool, sharp, with the bite of autumn creeping in, and the pavement glistened from an earlier drizzle. I climbed the stairs to 3B, my boots echoing in the empty hallway, the faint lavender scent mingling with the damp wood of the old building. My pulse was a drumbeat, loud and unsteady, and I couldn't tell if it was nerves or something else, something that had been building since that first night. I knocked and the door opened almost instantly, like she'd been waiting. Nora stood there, her hair loose and slightly tangled, falling over a faded blue sweater that clung to her shoulders. Her jeans were worn, soft-looking, like they'd been her go-to for years. She was older than me, late 30s or maybe 40, the lines around her eyes faint but telling, like she'd lived through things I could only guess at. Her hazel eyes were wide, almost startled, shadowed with a tiredness that made my chest ache. She looked beautiful, not in a polished way but in a raw, lived-in way, like a painting you couldn't stop staring at. "Finn," she said, her voice tight, almost brittle. "Thanks for coming. The sink, it's leaking again. Bad this time." I nodded, stepping inside, my toolbox heavier than it should have felt. The apartment was darker than before, lit only by a single lamp in the living room, casting long shadows across the cluttered bookshelves and sagging couch. The cinnamon scent was gone, replaced by something earthier, like old paper and coffee grounds. "What's going on with it?" I asked, setting my toolbox down in the kitchen, trying to keep my voice steady. "It started an hour ago," she said, following me, her arms wrapped around herself like she was holding something in. "Water's everywhere. Under the sink. I don't know what happened." I crouched, flashlight in hand, and peered under the sink. The coupling I'd replaced was intact, the pipes dry, no sign of a leak. I ran my fingers along the joints, checked the washer, the P-trap, nothing. The cabinet floor was bone dry, no bucket, no trace of water. My stomach twisted, I glanced up at her, and she was watching me, her lips pressed tight, her fingers digging into the sleeves of her sweater. "Nora," I said, standing slowly, brushing my hands on my jeans. "There's no leak. It's dry." "Everything's fine." She bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the floor, and I saw it, the tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders tensed. I thought I saw water," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was sure of it. Maybe I was wrong." I stepped closer, close enough to catch the faint floral scent of her perfume, the same one from that first night. "Hey," I said, softer than I meant to. "You okay?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at the sink, her breath uneven, her fingers curling tighter into her sleeves. The silence was heavy, thick with something unspoken, and I felt it, that pull, that electric charge that had been there from the start, stronger now, undeniable. I should have grabbed my toolbox and left, told her to call if anything else came up, but my feet wouldn't move. I was caught, tethered to her in a way I didn't understand. "Nora," I said again, my voice low, urgent. "What's going on? This isn't about the sink, is it?" She shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were raw, unguarded, like she'd let a wall crumble. "No," she whispered. "It's not." My chest tightened, my pulse a wild thing I couldn't control. "Talk to me," I said, stepping closer. close enough to see the faint freckles across her nose the way her hair caught the lamplight. "What's wrong?" She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that didn't match the softness in her eyes. "Everything, nothing. I don't even know where to start." She ran a hand through her hair, pacing a small circle in the kitchen, her steps quick, restless. "I've been alone for so long, Finn. My ex-husband left 3 years ago, took everything, the house, the life we built, the person I thought I was. I teach these kids about love and loss in books, but I don't feel it anymore. I'm just here going through the motions, pretending I'm okay when I'm not." Her words hit me like a punch, raw and unfiltered, and I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, watching her unravel, feeling like I was intruding on something private, but unable to look away. She stopped pacing, her eyes locking on mine, and I saw the weight she carried, grief, loneliness, a quiet strength that held it all together. "And then you show up," she said, her voice softer now, almost breaking. "This kid, except you're not a kid, are you? You're young, Finn, so young, but you look at me like I'm not just some tired professor who's forgotten how to live. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to handle it." My throat felt tight, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. "You're not tired," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "You're real, Nora. You're more real than anyone I've ever met." She looked at me, her eyes wide, searching, and I felt the world narrow to the space between us. The kitchen was too small, the air too thick, and I could see every detail, the faint lines around her eyes, the way her lips parted slightly, the way her hands trembled. "You don't get it," she said, her voice shaking. "You're too young. I'm too broken. This is wrong." "Don't say that," I said, stepping closer, close enough to feel the warmth of her, the faint scent of her perfume pulling me in. "You called me because you wanted to, and I came because I couldn't not come." Her breath hitched, and she looked up at me, her eyes locking on mine with an intensity that made my chest ache. The silence was deafening, the refrigerator's hum fading into nothing. I wanted to reach for her, to close the distance, but I didn't. Not yet. Not when she looked so fragile, like one wrong move would shatter her. "I shouldn't have called you," she said, her voice barely audible. It's not right." "Then why did you?" I asked, my voice rough, the words out before I could stop them. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed against mine. Her fingers were cold, but they sent a jolt through me, like touching a live wire. I didn't pull away, and neither did she. Her hand lingered, her fingers curling around mine, and I felt the weight of it, the impossibility, the pull, the thing we both knew was wrong but couldn't stop. "Finn," she whispered, her voice breaking, and she stepped closer, so close I could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, the way her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. For a moment I thought she might kiss me, and I wanted her to, more than I'd ever wanted anything. But she didn't. She leaned in, her forehead resting against mine, her breath warm against my cheek. It wasn't a kiss, but it was more intimate, more real than anything I'd ever felt. "We can't," she said, her voice a fragile thread. "You know we can't." "I know," I said, but I didn't move, didn't let go of her hand. We stood there, frozen in that moment, the world outside forgotten. Her trembling matched mine, not from cold, but from the weight of whatever this was, this thing we couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Then she pulled back, her hand slipping from mine, and the air felt colder, emptier. "You should go," she said, her voice steady now, but her eyes were still on me, still holding me in place. "Please, Finn, just go." I wanted to argue, to stay, to tell her that whatever this was, it wasn't nothing. But I saw the fear in her eyes, the guilt, the longing, and I knew she was right. This couldn't happen, not now, maybe not ever. I nodded, grabbing my toolbox, my chest aching in a way I didn't understand. Okay, I said, my voice rough. I'll go. At the door, I turned back, and she was still standing in the kitchen, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. Our eyes met, and for a second I thought she might call me back, might say something to change it all. But she didn't. "Good night, Nora," I said, stepping into the hallway. "Good night, Finn," she replied, her voice soft but final, like a door closing. I walked down the stairs, the cool night air hitting me like a slap as I stepped outside. The street lights flickered, casting long shadows across Marwood Lane, and I climbed into the van, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I didn't start the engine, I just sat there, replaying her words, her touch, the way her forehead had rested against mine. Something had changed, not just between us but inside me, and I knew it would stay with me, always,